African Kingdoms and Nation States, Unit 3, 600 AD to 1450. Now with this we're looking at Key Concept 3.2, Continuity and Innovations of State Forms and Their Interactions. State formation in this era demonstrates remarkable continuity, innovation, and diversity in various regions. In Afro-Eurasia, some states attempted with different degree of success to preserve or revive imperial structures, while some less centralized states continued to develop. The expansion of Islam introduced a new concept to the caliphate, to the Afro-Eurasian statecraft. Pastoral peoples in Eurasia built powerful and distinctive empires that integrated people and institutions from both pastoral and agrarian worlds. In the Americas, powerful states developed in both Mesoamerica and the Andean regions. Now the area that we're going to be focusing on is basically Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, if you look at the map, is everything basically south of that red line, right before you get to the Sahara Desert that spans east and west. So it's basically all the colored region that is green, red, orange, are the areas that we're going to call Sub-Saharan. So this is a pretty diverse landscape. We also have to look at a little more closely some of the African rivers that are very important to Sub-Saharan Africa, most notably the Niger River in West Africa, where a lot of these civilizations are going to spring up, as well as the Zambezi River, a little farther to the south, and we can't forget the Congo River, which dominates the jungles of Central Africa. So a lot of what we're looking at in Sub-Saharan Africa as far as political structure is concerned is we basically have stateless societies in a lot of these regions. It's very tribal. Expanded family units are very important, but it's very diverse and different as far as how these societies are run. So most of it is based on kinship and tribal society. Last unit we looked really briefly at the Bantu migration. The Bantu were a group of people who originated in Nigeria, modern-day Nigeria, and they spread all throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. And we know this because most of the languages in Sub-Saharan Africa, with few exceptions, have this Bantu root. So we know that they originated in Nigeria and spread all throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. They also spread a lot of their agricultural practices as well throughout the region. So basically, we're going to be looking at some of the state formations in Sub-Saharan Africa today, most notably the West African kingdoms on the Niger River, as well as the East African coastal towns, also known as the Swahili city-states, to the east. We're also going to look at Ethiopia and Great Zimbabwe as well. Now the first state that we look at in West Africa, because West Africa will be our first focus. West Africa, these kingdoms oftentimes were on the Niger River, and a lot of them are going to be very important as far as trade is concerned. Now Ghana springs up as a civilization from about 830 AD to 1591, when we see a lot of these West African kingdoms disappear. Ghana is the earliest of these kingdoms. It again springs up on the Niger River, and it's going to become very wealthy in the trade of gold and salt, most notably. Salt back then, at least in this region, would have been dug up from beneath the desert sand and cut up into huge slabs, about 4 to 6 feet in length, and they would take these slabs of salt and throw them over camels and transport them across the Sahara Desert to North Africa or the Barbary Coast. So the salt's going to be very important. Again, salt's a preservative. Before we had refrigeration or anything like that, a lot of people relied on salt to preserve their food, so that's going to fetch a pretty high price. But gold's going to be the one that, pretty much is going to be the moneymaker for Ghana. Prior to Columbus discovering the New World in 1492, Europe's main source of gold all through the Middle Ages was West Africa. So it's going to be a very lucrative trade, this trans-Saharan gold trade to markets in North Africa and Europe. Now, Ghana's main trade contact is going to be the Barbary Coast. Ever since the Arab armies had expanded after the death of Muhammad through North Africa and into Spain, Islamic culture basically dominates the North African coast. So the people of Ghana are basically going to have their main trade contact be Muslims. So it's kind of understood that Islam is going to spread across the trans-Saharan trade routes to Ghana and other areas of West Africa. And, it's just going to be good for business if you deal with people of a certain faith all the time and you're not of that faith. It might not make business run as smoothly. So it's seen that a lot of people in Ghana saw the opportunity to convert to Islam as a way to expand their business contacts, basically. So for a while there, Ghana's going to be the main West African kingdom. However, they fail in one thing, and that is to really, truly bring about political unification. And we're going to have basically a political breakdown and a successor kingdom, that is the Kingdom of Mali, take over not too long after Ghana kind of loses prominence. And if you look at this slide, guys, we got a number of the different West African kingdoms really quick. We already talked about Ghana from 830 to 1235, and now we'll talk about Mali from 1230 to 1550, Songhai 1340 to 1591, and so forth. But as you can see from the map here, basically these West African kingdoms dominate the same region, that is the area around the Niger River. So they are successive kingdoms, each kind of borrowing off the culture of the previous one, using Islam as a means of lubricating trade. In all three of these major West African kingdoms rely heavily on the trans-Saharan trade with salt and gold. Now the next African kingdom we got to look at is Mali. And as you can see in the map there, up to the right, you see the area that kind of that we're in control here. But some of the pictures here with these West African kingdoms, you can see, guys, to the left are salt slabs. These are what they were pretty much digging out of the earth. And at the bottom you see basically a caravan of camels. Now it was very important to transport goods via caravan across the desert. And the big reason for this was basically just protection. It was very important to travel as a bunch if you were traveling over land, because you needed X amount of these riders with you acting as protection. Because if you're traveling alone, if you were that stupid to travel alone, basically anybody could come along and just kill you and take your stuff. So it was important to travel kind of in a bunch here to get the goods across the desert. Now, Mali is probably the more famous of the West African kingdoms as far as when we look back at our history books, because it was the wealthiest. It was the one that was responsible for some of these great cities that were centers of trade and learning at this time period. But Mali is going to be at its height in the 13th through about the 15th century. And just like the successor state before it, Ghana, Islam is going to be a very important part of Mali culture. Mali expands very rapidly as far as territory is concerned, and pretty much turns a lot of these areas in the desert into thriving trade towns. Again, money is going to be made off of gold and salt, just like the previous kingdom. So the most famous of these like trading towns that pop up basically in the middle of the desert is Timbuktu. Timbuktu is going to be at its height of metropolitan culture in the 1300s. It's going to have a population of about 50,000 at its peak. It boasted a lot of universities, great libraries, centers of worship and prayer. As you see in the picture here, that's the Great Mosque of Timbuktu, and it's one of the sites you can actually go visit today if you ever were to make it out there. But again, this is also going to be showing how Islam spreads even further into the region as Mali culture grows. And there we can look at the map, guys, the area of the Mali Empire. As you can see in the blue, you see the Niger River, where Timbuktu near would have been popping up along the crook of the Niger, as they call it. So again, we're looking at empires that have this successive dominance in the same area, basically. Kind of an interesting little story to show how wealthy the Kingdom of Mali was. We get a king of Mali with the name of Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa, like all elite in Mali, was a Muslim. And as you guys know from learning about Islam earlier, you know, there were certain pillars, there were 5 pillars that you had to complete in order to be a good Muslim. One of those is the Hajj. All right, you need to take a pilgrimage to Mecca, or at least plan to take one once in your lifetime. So Mansa Musa had planned to do this. He made the preparations, got many different caravans ready to go. He left Timbuktu, making his way to Mecca. Another part, or one of the pillars, is charity. A certain amount of your income needs to go to charitable means. So Mansa Musa thought he would knock out a couple of these requirements on being a good Muslim, that being the Hajj and charity. And so when he's on his journey, basically into Egypt, Cairo more specifically, he goes through and has a great parade and procession basically leading him through the city. And during this procession through Cairo, he ends up giving away gold to the poor, basically giving it away like it was nothing. And so he gave away so much gold to the poor in Cairo that gold was worthless in Egypt. So there was no demand for it because everybody had it. So kind of shows you the great wealth that Mali had, and kind of, you know, demonstrates the wealth that they, and the resources that they actually had. Now the final West African kingdom that we're looking at is Songhai. Now Songhai, like the previous civilizations in the area, again, going to make its money off of the gold trade and salt across the Sahara Desert. But Songhai actually ends up discovering a new source of gold in West Africa that was pretty much an untapped resource, and they're going to utilize that and grow in wealth and prestige in the region. Now again, mind you, this is Europe's main source of gold during the Middle Ages. Would have been this region, so it's very, very lucrative. However, the wealth of Songhai didn't really rub off onto, you know, their technological advancements. Only the elite in Songhai had the newest firearms, so it was really kept to the elite, whereas the army was mostly made up of, you know, traditional fighting means. They didn't have firearms or guns or anything like that. So basically what you're going to have is you're going to have a Muslim army from the Barbary Coast, that's North Africa, invade Songhai. This Barbary army in 1591 is wielding firearms, and they just, you know, are responsible for bringing down this last great West African kingdom. But it goes to show you that, you know, technology and the spread of European technology, in particular military technology, is going to be very important at this time in seeing which civilizations are going to survive and which ones are going to, you know, be the conquered, which ones are going to be taken over. Now, the next region we got to look at, as far as Sub-Saharan Africa is concerned, is East Africa. Now, East Africa hugs the Indian Ocean coastline and goes a little bit to the interior to Zimbabwe and modern-day Ethiopia. Now, the area that is the east coast of Africa, we also call it the Swahili coast. Now, what we're going to have pop up on the east coast of Africa are very prosperous trading towns along the coast, most notably Mombasa, Zanzibar, Mogadishu, just to name a couple. These are going to grow very wealthy with the Indian Ocean trade and be pretty much dominating the region. Now, they're set up politically almost as city-states. So Mogadishu would be in control of its city and the surrounding area. They're not necessarily empires. like we saw in West Africa. But it's a shame because you hear a lot about, or you did, at least you used to, in the news about Mogadishu and other places in East Africa and how they're now part of Somalia, which is pretty much a failed state. So these great East African cities at one time, boasted some of the most prosperous trade in the world. Today are basically war-torn and have definitely seen better days. So what we're going to look at with the culture on these East African trading cities is the Swahili culture. Now, the Swahili culture is a unique combination of Arabic culture and native East African. And they kind of melded together to create this unique Swahili culture and Swahili language as well. So the main contact with these Swahili city-states in East Africa is going to be Arab traders on the Indian Ocean trade routes. But these areas are going to be very metropolitan and, be connected with the rest of the world pretty extensively. A lot of what was coming out of these East African towns as far as trade goods is concerned is ivory, timber, gold, iron from the African interior. Ivory was a hot commodity out of Africa. Elephants exist in Asia, but don't wield the amount of, if at all, ivory that you get out of the African elephant. So ivory is going to be a very, very hot commodity to come out of these African towns. And if we look at it, it's really going to make these areas very, very wealthy. We also see some archaeological evidence in some of these East African Swahili towns. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain and pottery that, through different trade networks that come all the way from China. But, what was really coming in a lot was Indian spices and things from the Arab world, for sure. And just like we saw in West Africa, Islam is going to be the main religion that we see along these trade routes and along the East African coast. Again, the Swahili city-states traded mainly with Arab traders. So again, it would have been good for business and good for your business if you were the same faith as the people you were trading and doing business with. But it's pretty important to look at that when we're not just trading goods along these routes, guys. Ideas are being traded, religions are being exchanged, new languages are being formed. So trade is really truly a cultural exchange of everything that we're looking at. So there's the area we're looking at with the map, guys. The area in peach is kind of the East African. Is where the East African city-states would have been. And off to the right is just an artistic depiction of some of the trading vessels used in the Indian Ocean trade. The other civilization we got to look at briefly in East Africa is in modern-day Ethiopia, and that's the Kingdom of Aksum, spelled two different ways, depending on what source you really look at. But what's unique about Aksum is that in the 4th century, that's the 300s, Aksum converts to Christianity. They are one of the earliest Christian kingdoms ever. This is about the same time that Constantine and the succeeding Roman emperors would have done it. So it's a really old Christian culture that we have here in this part of Africa. The successor kingdom to Aksum is the Kingdom of Ethiopia. A lot of Ethiopian elites and wealthy individuals within Ethiopia continue to carry on the Christian tradition and remain Christian. So there's a very large population of Christians within the Kingdom of Ethiopia, but Islam definitely had its influences on the region. But if we look at the map of where Ethiopia is, they're completely surrounded by Muslim territories in North Africa, in East Africa with the Swahili states. So they're surrounded by Islamic states, and they're completely cut off from the Christian world. When I mean the Christian world, I mean Europe mostly. So the Christianity that you get in Ethiopia is very unique. It's very much influenced by African animistic beliefs. There's a lot of, or heavy use of amulets and charms and ways to ward off evil. So it's a very unique form of Christianity. By being Christian in basically a world that's dominated by Islam, Ethiopia is also isolated to some degree because of this. It's more inland than the East African city-states. So it's not as metropolitan in the sense that Zanzibar would have been, or Mogadishu at the same time. So it's kind of an interesting culture to look at for sure, but it dominates Northeast Africa at this time. Now, what we're looking at with the pictures, guys, is on the left, that's an Ethiopian monastery that's actually dug into a cliffside, or into a cliff. And it's not too clear of a picture, but if you look at it, it's 90 feet deep into the earth in the shape of a cross. That's one of the more famous landmarks in Ethiopia. And on the right, we have a Coptic cross. The Coptics are what we call a lot of the Christians in Ethiopia. Coptic Christians are also pretty widespread in modern-day Egypt as well. So we tend to think of a lot of these modern-day countries as, homogeneous or, simply Islamic or what have you. But Coptic Christians within Egypt and Christianity in Ethiopia is still a large part of the population. Now, the last great African kingdom that we're going to look at is the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, modern-day Zimbabwe, guys, is in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's a little farther inland. Modern-day Zimbabwe is. But what we're going to have here in the 11th century is this kingdom spring up in Zimbabwe. Again, a lot of the growth is attributed to trade. So we see the importance of trade in the growth of a lot of these areas. But the Kingdom of Zimbabwe is going to be very famous for trading two important objects again, or goods. That is ivory and gold. The region's very, very much wealthy in minerals. That's even true to this day. So the people of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe are definitely going to utilize the gold wealth that they have. And their main trade contact would have been the Swahili coastal towns. So they would have had a direct link to the Swahili coastal towns and then the Indian Ocean trade, and from there, basically the rest of the world. We have found archaeologically in Great Zimbabwe, again, pottery shards from China, that would have made it through the different trade routes to reach Great Zimbabwe. The other thing that stands out about the Kingdom of Zimbabwe is more specifically Great Zimbabwe. Now, what we have with Great Zimbabwe that you see is what you see in the pictures here, and it's stone masonry work, which you do not see too often in sub-Saharan African cultures. So if you look at the picture here, guys, this is very much skillful work with stone. And there's different parts of Great Zimbabwe. On the right there, you see it's called the enclosure, and it was believed that kings of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe would have lived within this area, within the enclosure, and also the enclosure would have acted as protection against attack from neighboring tribes. But it's a very impressive structure that we get to see here with Great Zimbabwe. And again, you don't see it very often with a lot of these sub-Saharan African cultures. Now, what's also kind of interesting about Great Zimbabwe is the fact that there's no evidence that stone work, or how to work with stone, diffused to the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. So there's some that theorize that these people came up independently with how to work with stone like this. So it kind of shows and demonstrates a general sophistication and wealth that Great Zimbabwe, or the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, must have had in order to pull this off. So basically what we're seeing here is by 1500, a large portion of sub-Saharan Africa is connected more thoroughly through trade, brought together through the different trade networks. And religion, we're seeing, It's kind of acting as a glue to keep a lot of these different peoples together. So trade's going to be something we're looking at, guys. That's a constant throughout history. That's going to be responsible for, bringing people together, sharing ideas, sharing culture, religion, and so forth. So we're going to see Africa, by the time we get to the year 1500, being this completely different place than it would have been 1,000 years before.